Hello, it's Abby here again. I'm hoping that you are all doing well. It's Saturday here today, so I'm taking the opportunity to film a video, and I thought I would look at my love of history. Now, I'm not an expert in history, which is why I really enjoy this set of books. I bought these books when my children were little to help them with their schoolwork, but I find there's some interesting facts and they're beautifully illustrated and suits me because they're so simple to read and understand. And obviously the history of Britain is very long and very complex and not always pleasant, but it's interesting, very interesting to read about days gone by. So I'll just show you this box. It's an Usborne History of Britain, and it has got, I'll just turn the box over. You can see that there are 8 books, okay, and they range from prehistoric Britain all the way to Britain since the Second World War, so quite a range there. So if we turn it to the side, we can see all the beautiful books, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a book and we'll have a little look through it together, and hopefully you will enjoy the facts and maybe learn a thing or two. I certainly will. So let's get started. Okay, so the book I have chosen is The Tudors and Stuarts, okay, because it's a particular interest of mine. It's a fascinating time in British history, time of big change, not all good, obviously, and so the cover of the book shows Elizabeth I and the Royal Towers of London in the background. Okay, and if we look on the back, there's a man, I don't know. Oh, it's Gunpowder Plot, is it? Perhaps, maybe. Yeah, I think it might be. And it says, from battles and beheadings to plots and plague, this book tells the story of life in Britain under the Tudors and Stuarts. Follow the dramatic events that shaped Britain at a time of adventurous explorers, scientific geniuses, and political trailblazers. It's a lovely picture there of London. So we start here with a golden age. The 16th and 17th centuries were a time of momentous change in Britain. Under the Tudor monarchs, England and Wales were finally united, and the English gained control of parts of Ireland. The Tudors and the Scottish royal family, the Stuarts, later renamed Stuarts, different spelling, also came together through a marriage which later brought the two countries under one Stuart king. It was an age of great religious upheaval, which eventually saw Protestantism replace Catholicism as the official faith in Britain. Many people's views of the world changed dramatically too, as adventurers explored new lands and the arts and sciences flourished in what became known as a golden age. So, this is about the first Tudor, okay? And there's a lovely pictures up here. Portrait of Henry VII and Elizabeth surrounded by York and Lancaster roses. And it says here that Henry created a new family emblem, the Tudor rose, by combining the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster. And there's the Tudor rose. You see that? In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth and became Henry VII, the first Tudor king of England. His victory ended 30 years of bloody civil war between two branches of the royal family, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. Henry, who was a Lancastrian, brought the two sides of the family together by marrying Elizabeth of York. His reign promised a new period of wealth and stability in the kingdom. Although he had married Elizabeth, Henry still feared that his Yorkist enemies might try to seize power. To strengthen his position, he took their estates and had some of them executed for treason. He also brought in high taxes and banned nobles from raising their own armies. If they broke his laws, they were tried in court, the Star Chamber, and fined heavily. Plots and pretenders. Henry was right to be suspicious. He faced several Yorkist plots to overthrow him. Often his enemies were helped by the Irish and by the kings of Scotland and France, England's traditional enemies. In 1487, a group of Yorkists persuaded a boy named Lambert Simnel to pretend he was Richard III's nephew, the Earl of Warwick, who they believed had a stronger claim to the throne than Henry did. But the real Warwick was a prisoner in the Tower of London, and Henry paraded him through the streets to prove it. Simnel was arrested and sent to work in the royal kitchens as a punishment. In 1491, a more serious threat came from a man named Perkin Warbeck, who pretended to be another of Richard III's nephews, Richard, Duke of York. It was thought that the real Richard had been murdered in the Tower of London, but Warbeck claimed that he had escaped from the tower and fled abroad. an army and invaded England, but he was defeated and later hanged as a traitor. James and Margaret. Among Warbeck's supporters was the Stuart King of Scotland, James IV. England and Scotland had often fought in the past, and the Scots sometimes sided with the French against England. But when Warbeck's plot failed, James decided it was time to make peace with the English. To prevent further fighting, a treaty was signed, and in 1503 James married Henry's daughter, Margaret. This brought together the Stuart and Tudor families, but the marriage didn't bring peace for long. 10 years later, James IV was killed while fighting the English at the Battle of Flodden. And there's some small facts about Tudor society at the side. It says Henry kept close control over the nobles, but he still needed their support. They were at the top level of Tudor society. Nobles were men with titles such as Lord, Duke and Earl, and they came from important families which owned lots of land. The gentry were wealthy, well educated, and didn't need to work with their hands for a living. They included rich merchants and knights. Yeoman farmers owned land which they worked on themselves. The lowest classes of society included tenant farmers who rented land, farm workers, servants and beggars. This group made up 90% of Britain's population. Of my dog in the book. I'm not quite sure why. I think that's my daughter's doing. So this chapter is about Henry VIII, probably one of our most well-known and infamous monarchs. So here's a portrait which was created by Hans Holbein, who was a German painter, and it shows Henry in all his fine clothes and jewels to show off his wealth and power, and he looks like a formidable character, doesn't he? In 1509, Henry VII died and was succeeded by his 18-year-old son, who became Henry VIII. The new king had a huge appetite for pleasure, eating too much, drinking too much, and spending most of the money that his father had saved on grand banquets and arrogant displays of power. Tudor tantrums. The young king was incredibly athletic and often challenged the nobles in his court, known as courtiers, to wrestling or jousting competitions. Henry always won, of course. No one dared to beat him. The courtiers lived in constant fear of the king's childish moods. He often flew into sudden rages, thrashing them with sticks or bursting into tears. As his reign wore on, Henry grew paranoid, believing that his courtiers would betray him. So he encouraged them to spy on each other. He executed some of his most trusted ministers simply because of lies that were spread by rivals. It says down here, as this portrait shows, Henry VIII was an imposing figure of a man. Not only was he broad-chested, but historians believe he could have been as tall as 190 centimetres or 6'4" at the time, when people were, on average, shorter than they were today. So I wonder if that's true, or whether it was just something that he liked to tell people. The King's Cardinal. At first, the most powerful minister in the land was Henry's Chancellor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. He wasn't a noble, but he was hard-working and ambitious, and soon became the king's closest advisor. At the height of his powers, Wolsey owned palaces and founded schools and colleges. Many courtiers hated him for his wealth and his influence over Henry. Henry's great matter. Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, and they had a daughter, Mary. As Catherine got older, Henry worried she would never have a son, and the problem became known in court as the King's Great Matter. In around 1527, Henry fell in love with one of his courtiers, Anne Boleyn. He wanted to divorce Catherine so he could marry Anne and have another chance to father a son. But since England was a Catholic nation, divorces had to be agreed by the Pope, and he wouldn't allow it. Henry turned to Wolsey to find a solution. Wolsey failed, and his enemies pounced. They accused him of treason and turned the king against him. Wolsey fell ill and died in 1530 on his way to face the charges. The break with Rome. Although Henry was a devout Catholic, he saw that the only way to get the divorce he wanted was to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. So he ordered Parliament and Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, to declare him as supreme head of the Church in England instead of the Pope. Now he could do whatever he liked. And here at the side we have the King's 6 wives. So his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon ended in divorce. He had Anne Boleyn executed on charges of witchcraft and adultery after she bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Jane Seymour was Anne Boleyn's lady-in-waiting. She died after giving birth to a son, Edward. Henry divorced his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, deciding that she was ugly. He had Catherine Howard executed for having affairs. Catherine Parr looked after the old king until he died. when Henry died in 1547, he spoke the name of Jane Seymour, the only wife that it is said that he truly loved. So this is about Henry's new powers. So there's a picture of some monks there. You can see the monks. And it says it's the pilgrimage of grace. Some people were angry with Henry's harsh treatment of the monks. In October 1536, an army of 30,000 people marched from the north of England in protest. It was known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry promised to consider their grievances, but as soon as the protesters had dispersed, he arrested their leaders and executed them. And this is a picture here of the Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire. It's one of the many wealthy English monasteries that fell into ruin after being closed down. Once Henry was in charge of the church in England, he began using it to increase his own wealth. During the 16th century, there were 850 monasteries in England, which were home to over 9,000 monks and nuns. They owned over a quarter of the country's land, which made them very rich. Henry decided to shut them down and take their money. The dissolution of the monasteries, as it became known, lasted 4 years, from 1536 to 1540. Led by Henry's new Chancellor, Thomas Cromwell, the king's men looted the monasteries, stealing anything of value. Some of the buildings were burned to the ground, others were simply left to crumble. The valuable lead stripped from their roofs, and beautiful stained glass windows smashed. Wales and Ireland. As well as making himself rich at the expense of the monasteries, Henry extended his power over Wales and Ireland, both Catholic countries. English kings had ruled over Wales for years, and Henry was of Welsh descent. But some areas were controlled by powerful Catholic nobles known as marcher lords, who made their own laws and appointed their own officials. Henry worried that after his break with Rome, the marcher lords wouldn't be loyal to him. So, in 1536, he reunited Wales and England and brought in English law for the Welsh. One of Henry's titles was Lord of Ireland, but in fact he had little power there, and the Catholic Fitzgeralds, the leading nobles in Ireland, often rebelled against him. Henry sent in an army to restore order, and in 1541 he declared himself King of Ireland. But it made little difference. Many Irishmen deeply resented the English claims to their country, and they refused to break with Rome as Henry had done. And there's a little bit on the side about Solway Moss. Henry urged his nephew, James V of Scotland, James IV's son, to break from Rome, but to his uncle's fury, James refused to do it. Before long, England and Scotland were at war, and James sent a large army to invade England. At the Battle of Solway Moss, the Scots outnumbered the English 3-1, but they were so disorganised that the English quickly sent them fleeing from the battlefield. The defeat broke James. He died 2 weeks later, and the crown passed to his baby daughter, Mary. If you can see that. There we go. Fortress England. So there's a little bit on the side which says Wrestling Kings. In 1520, Henry met Francis I of France at a huge peace conference named the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Everything went well until Henry challenged Francis to a wrestling match. Francis won, but the English said that he had cheated. The conference failed to prevent war from breaking out again. There's lots of pictures there of battles at sea. When Henry came to the throne, the most powerful countries in Europe were Spain and France. England and France had always been enemies, and although Henry met the French king for a peace conference, the hostility continued throughout his reign. But after his break from Rome, Henry grew worried that the Catholic kings of both Spain and France were planning to invade England. So, using the stone from the abandoned monasteries, he built forts along the south coast to protect his country from attack. You can see the forts. The Royal Navy. Before Henry VIII, English kings had borrowed trading ships for battles, as they didn't have a navy of their own. But now Henry built up a huge fleet of ships to protect England. The most formidable warship was named Henri Gracedieu. It had 5 decks and over 200 cannons. But Henry was fondest of his flagship, the Mary Rose. In 1545, the Mary Rose set sail to fight the French, but it was so overloaded with cannons and men that it sank, with Henry watching with horror from the shore. So here it says that this painting shows Henry's warship Henri Gracedieu leaving England, carrying the king to the field of the cloth of gold. And a little bit here it says, blast from the past. Tudor ships were armed with incredibly powerful cannons that needed teams of 3 or 4 people to load and fire. This was a dangerous job. The cannons sometimes blew up, killing the men who operated them. And I've actually been to see the Mary Rose in Portsmouth. They found it, didn't they, and brought it up. It's fascinating. So this chapter is about the Tudor countryside. So on the side here it says, working in the fields. Farm workers had to be ready to do whatever was asked of them. Their jobs were different at different times of the year. The work included sowing seeds, harvesting crops, cutting back vines, shearing sheep, or building walls to mark out areas of land. While Henry and his troops were busy fighting the French, most people in Britain lived in rural areas and rarely left the villages where they had been born. All kinds of people lived in the countryside, from wealthy nobles with large estates to poor beggars who lived on village streets. But most country folk were farmers. They made their living by growing crops and grazing their animals. The poorest used common land that was free to be used by anyone. A farmer's life. Farmers spent almost all of their time working outside, while their wives stayed at home, preparing and preserving food, baking bread, brewing beer, and taking care of young children. By the time they were around 7 years old, the children would begin work too. Young girls helped their mothers in the house, and boys joined their fathers in the fields. Everyone had to work hard to provide the food for the family. But however hard they worked, if the harvest was bad, everyone went hungry. For the poorest farm workers, life was much the same as it had been during the Middle Ages. They lived in tiny, cold cottages. A few people had small glass windows, but most had to make do with bits of cloth or simple wooden shutters to keep out the cold. There was very little furniture. A table and some stools was all that most could afford. Often whole families lived together in a single room, which they shared with their animals, usually a few chickens, whose eggs they would sell. If times were hard, the chickens could be killed and eaten. Market Day. On Market Day, people set off for the nearest town with produce to sell. For most, this was the furthest they went from home. Roads were bumpy, muddy tracks, and thieves were everywhere. The market was a place to meet friends, attracting everyone in the area. There were also festivals and country fetes, often on special days such as Easter and Christmas. Kett's Rebellion. Meanwhile, life was getting harder for the poorest farmers. In the 1500s, wealthy landowners began fencing off areas of common land for themselves. They wanted to make money by rearing sheep there and selling wool. This process, called enclosure, left many people with no land to farm. Fences were torn down in protest, and in 1549 a farmer named Robert Kett gathered an army of rebels in Norwich, demanding that the enclosures be pulled down. The rebellion was brutally crushed by the Earl of Warwick. And there's a little picture there, and it says fun and games. For rich nobles, the countryside was like a playground. They enjoyed hunting deer with dogs or bows and arrows, and hawking, using trained birds of prey to catch rabbits and pheasants. And there's a picture of a fete here in the village of Bermondsey. Rebirth and reform. During the 15th and 16th centuries, a great cultural movement swept across Europe. This became known as the Renaissance or Rebirth, because artists and writers rediscovered ideas from ancient Greek and Roman civilizations and produced brilliant works of art and literature. At the same time, great thinkers and scientists came up with new ideas and discoveries that gradually changed people's lives. And it says here, this is a detail from The Ambassadors by the Renaissance painter Hans Holbein. The men, a merchant and a cleric, were surrounded by instruments of Renaissance learning. In the middle of the floor, you can see the squashed image of a human skull, a reminder that death comes to everyone. Interesting picture. Renaissance men. In England and Scotland, King Henry VIII and King James IV led the way as Renaissance men. Well educated in all fields of art and literature, and dedicated to learning. Henry played several instruments, wrote music, and spoke French, Latin, and Spanish. He invited great painters like the German Hans Holbein to the English court. James was even more impressive. One great scholar of the Renaissance, the Dutchman Erasmus, said he had an astonishing knowledge of everything. Like Henry, James spoke several languages and was fascinated by the arts. he founded universities and encouraged noblemen to send their children to school. The Protestant Reformation. In Europe, meanwhile, trouble was brewing. A German monk named Martin Luther had begun to attack the Catholic Church, arguing that it needed to be reformed. His ideas soon became the basis for a new form of Christianity called Protestantism. Protestants claimed that the church was rich and corrupt. They rejected the authority of the Pope and believed that church services should be read in their own language instead of Latin. Throughout Europe, Christians argued fiercely over religion. Under the leadership of Henry and James, England and Scotland remained Catholic. But as books and pamphlets written by Protestants flowed into Britain, people began to move away from Catholicism. When Henry and James died, the next few years were dominated by struggles over whether England and Scotland would be Catholic or Protestant. There's little pictures at the side. Printing ideas. New ideas spread fast, thanks to a method of printing invented during the late Middle Ages by a German, Johannes Gutenberg. Johannes Gutenberg. His printing press meant that books and pamphlets could be easily produced and read aloud in public places. During the Reformation, books helped to spread the word about Martin Luther and Protestantism. I'm struggling to say that word. Religious turmoil. Henry VIII died in 1547, and the crown passed on to his 9-year-old son, who became Edward VI. Since Edward was so young, his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, was appointed to rule on his behalf. Under his uncle's influence, Edward made changes to the English church to bring it closer to the ideas of European Protestants. The 9-Day Queen. But Edward became ill, and in 1553 he died, naming his successor as his 17-year-old Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. When Jane was proclaimed queen, Edward's Catholic half-sister Mary, who was next in line for the throne, was horrified. She gathered support, then marched to London, took power, and began preparing for her coronation. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London and later beheaded. She had only been queen for 9 days and hadn't even been crowned. And there's a 19th century painting of Lady Jane Grey's execution. And then there's a little bit here about Edward VI. Just a little baby there, look. This portrait shows Edward VI at 6 months old. He grew up to be an intelligent, serious boy and oversaw big changes to the English church. Paintings, statues, and stained glass windows were smashed or removed. Church services were held in English instead of Latin. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, introduced a Protestant prayer book to be used by everyone in England. Bloody Mary. As soon as she became queen, Mary turned back the clocks. She made the Pope head of the English Church and freed Catholic priests whom Edward had imprisoned, locking up Protestant clergy instead. She also married a Catholic, the future King Philip II of Spain, despite many people's fears that this would give the Spanish power over England. During the 5 years of Mary's reign, she had more than 300 Protestants burned alive at the stake. By the time she died in 1558, Mary was so unpopular among Protestants that they nicknamed her Bloody Mary and celebrated the day of her death each year. Mary never had any children, so it was left to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth to take the throne. The Scottish Reformation. Meanwhile, north of the border, the Protestant Reformation swept through England. At its head was a fiery preacher named John Knox, who attacked Catholicism in his sermons. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament voted in Protestantism as the country's official religion. At this time, James IV's Catholic daughter Mary, Queen of Scots, was living in France as the wife of the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. It was here that she changed her name from Stuart to Stuart to sound more French. Still same saying to me, but there we go, just a different spelling. When her husband died in 1560, Mary returned to her kingdom of Scotland, which had been ruled by her mother while she was away. But she found that her Catholic faith made her unwelcome. It seemed that in England and Scotland, the battle between Catholics and Protestants had been won by the Protestants, for now at least. The Book of the Martyrs. After Mary's death, a man named John Foxe put together a Book of Martyrs, with accounts of Protestants who had been burned for their beliefs. A copy was put in every church to remind people of the horrors of Catholic rule. Shown here, in his clerical robes, John Knox was a fierce opponent of the Catholic Queen and thought it was wrong for women to be monarchs. Elizabeth I. Bloody Mary's half-sister, Elizabeth, was crowned Queen of England in 1558. The daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I became one of the most successful monarchs in European history. She was a brilliant politician and diplomat, and during her reign, England became an important European power. She made the country Protestant once again, but she didn't execute Catholics unless they plotted against her. And there's a lovely picture of her. Queen Elizabeth knew how important it was to look like a monarch. Here, courtiers carry her in her litter, a finely decorated portable chair. Elizabeth's courtiers. Elizabeth surrounded herself with a court of over 1,000 leading men, who flattered her with displays of dancing and recitals of love poetry. Some of them even kept their marriages secret in case it upset her. These courtiers depended on Elizabeth for their wealth, as she could grant them land and titles. Those that she liked best, such as Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, became very rich. Elizabeth also made rules for her court to create a strong image for the monarchy. Courtiers were never allowed to turn their backs on her. After speaking to her, they had to walk away backwards. Wherever the Queen went, trumpet fanfares announced her arrival. That's how to be a monarch. Royal tours. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth went on regular tours, known as progresses, around the south of England, staying as a guest with chosen courtiers. She always made her host provide lavish entertainment for the entire court, saving her vast amounts of money. A visit from the Queen was a huge privilege, but it was so ruinously expensive that many courtiers dreaded her arrival. The Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's chief advisers, known as the Privy Council, hoped that the Queen would marry and give birth to an heir. Many important men, including Philip II of Spain, her sister Mary's widower, wanted to win power by marrying her. But Elizabeth didn't want to share her position with anyone. Because she never married, she is sometimes called the Virgin Queen. There's a little side section about royal beauty. Everyone wanted to look like the Queen. Women went to great lengths to copy her striking white makeup and red hair. For the skin, they rubbed on toxic mixture of white lead, vinegar and raw white egg white. False veins were then painted on to make the skin look even paler. They dyed or bleached their hair or wore wigs like Elizabeth herself. Several of Elizabeth's teeth were rotten and black. Many women even copied this, rubbing their teeth with soot to make them black. We've always done strange things in the name of beauty, haven't we? Elizabethan fashion. Queen Elizabeth probably got her dress sense from her father. He took great care over his appearance and loved to dress up in fine clothing and jewels. But he became worried that some wealthy merchants were better dressed than his nobles, and he wanted everyone to be able to spot a noble. So he introduced new sumptuary laws to control what clothing people wore. Nobles could wear materials and dyes that were banned for other people, however rich they were. Dressed to impress. By the time of Elizabeth's reign, everyone wanted to show off by wearing elegant clothes. Elizabeth herself is said to have owned more than 250 gowns. A person's clothing was a way of displaying how rich and powerful they were. For instance, black dye was very expensive, so nobles wore black clothing so that people knew they were rich. Dressed for work. While fashions moved quickly among nobles, little changed for poorer people in society. Their clothes were made to work in, and so were much more practical. They were spun out of thick, itchy wool, and were usually brown, since this was the cheapest dye. Farmers often wore just a tunic, so they didn't get too hot. So there's a picture there of some people, some children. It says young adults. Young boys and girls from noble families were dressed like small adults. Here, the children of Lady Tarsberg were dressed up to look just like Queen Elizabeth. Their mother is standing at the back wearing an expensive black gown. There's a bit here on gentlemen of the court. Elizabeth's courtiers were the best dressed people in all of Britain. Male courtiers wore lots of layers to make themselves look big and impressive. Some even wore shoulder pads and stuffed their clothing. First, they put on a shirt and a coat called a doublet. The doublet was fastened with laces. Buttons were just for decoration. A jerkin went over the doublet. A long gown or cloak went on top. This was often trimmed with fur. On Sundays, every man wore a hat. Ladies of the court. Ladies of the court were just as stylish as the men. They dressed in richly embroidered gowns made of heavy materials such as velvet. Underneath, they wore special undergarments to change the shape of their bodies. A farthingale was a cone-shaped frame that pushed out the gown. Many ladies wore a figure hugging bodies to flatten their curves. A pomander, a container of sweet-smelling spice, was hung from the waist. Ladies had servants to help them dress. Both men and women wore large, frilly collars called ruffs. Okay, and I'm going to leave it there for today, but I will come back and read some more to you, if that's okay. And if you've got any requests of anything you'd like me to look at or have a look into, that would be wonderful to hear about as well. So thank you very much again for listening, and I hope you found that quite interesting. As I say, it's a nice, simple overview of British history, which I quite like. So I hope you all have a good week, and I will hopefully see you again soon. So take care for now, and I'll see you soon.